Good evening, everybody. I'd like to welcome you to the National Library. We're very pleased to have you all with us tonight. My name is Risa Zal. I'm the head of Resource Development and Partnerships here at the library, and I am very privileged to introduce the chairman of our board of directors, Mr. David Blumberg, who will provide an introduction to Rabbi Sachs.
ערב טוב. אנחנו שמחים מאוד מאוד לארח אתכם במשכנה של הספרייה הלאומית. אני בטוח שאתם מתרשמים מהמראה הזה, מההיכל הזה, ובוודאי מהתוכן שנציג בהמשך. מכובדי הרב זקס, מוריי ורבותיי, הרב פרופסור זקס, רבה הראשי של בריטניה בין השנים 1991 ו-2013, יועצם של ראשי ממשלות, מוכר בין היתר בזכות ספריו ומאמריו, אשר יקנו לו מעמד של הוגה דעות ומנהיג רוחני בולט. לא רק של העם היהודי, אלא של העולם המערבי כולו. הרב משמיע את קולה של היהדות בשיח העולמי, והדבר בא לידי ביטוי בין היתר בספריו שיצאו לאור בעברית, ביניהם משבר וברית, מחשבה יהודית מודרנית ופוסט-מודרנית, לכבוד השוני, לרפא עולם שבור, החיים כקריאה לאחריות, והשותפות הגדולה, הדת, המדע והחיפוש אחר משמעות. הרב זקס הוא מידידי הספרייה הלאומית, ורק לאחרונה הוא הקדיש 3 ימים תמימים להכיר מקרוב את אוצרותיה ואת תהליכי עבודתה. דומני שהתלהבותו של הרב ממה שהוא ראה בספרייה, האוספים, אבל לא פחות האנשים, הייתה רבה. אנו מקווים שידידות זאת תימשך עוד שנים ארוכות. אנחנו מודים לו על הסכמתו לשמש כחבר בפורום המכובד, בפורום הבינלאומי של הספרייה הלאומית, שכולל את הבולטים שבאנשי הרוח וההגות היהודיים בעולם כולו. בעיני הרב זקס, היהדות משמיעה את קולה של התקווה, ואילו הדת בעיניו היא קריאה לאדם לקחת אחריות על הסובב ולא להיכנע לגורמים שרירותיים, דטרמיניסטיים או שלטוניים. היחידים אינם חסרי אונים לנוכח כוחות על אנושיים. אנו יכולים לשנות את עצמנו, ובאמצעות מערכות יחסים מיוסדות ברית עם אחרים, אנו יכולים לשנות גם את העולם. אמונה זו עומדת גם בתשתית הפעילות של הספרייה הלאומית, והיא לדעתי הבסיס לידידות האמיצה בין הרב זקס לבין הספרייה הלאומית. אני חייב לספר לכם שבאופן מיוחד מצאתי עניין והזדהות עם תפיסתו של הרב, כפי שבאה לידי ביטוי בספרו לכבוד השוני. את הייחודיות המאפיינת כל אחד מהעמים בעולם. לדעתו, התשובה לשאלה מדוע להיות יהודי היא שליהודים יש שליחות, להגן על זכותו של כל עם להיות שונה. אין לי ספק שמפגש הרצונות והעשייה של הספרייה הלאומית והרב אכן מתגבש בזירה נוספת, ובה אנו מצויים כיום. הספרייה הלאומית, כידוע לכם, אוספי הספרייה הלאומית ממוקדים ב4 תחומים: יהדות, ישראל, אסלאם והמזרח התיכון, וכן מדעי הרוח הכלליים. השילוב הזה, החיבור הזה, נועד בדיוק למטרה שעל אודותיה הצביע הרב, לא רק להגן על זכותו של כל אחד להיות שונה, אלא לפתח ולעודד את החשיבות המפרה. החיבורים שהקוראים שלנו עושים בין האוספים עומדים בתשתית הפעילות המחקרית, ובמובן זה אני מאמין שאנחנו אכן אור לגויים. אנחנו נמצאים היום בעיצומו של תהליך התחדשות של הספרייה הלאומית. תהליך שבמסגרתו, בין היתר, נבנה בניין חדש לספרייה. תוך מספר שנים אנחנו ניפרד מהבניין הזה ונעבור לבניין פתוח, רחב, נגיש הרבה יותר, שיבטא את רצונה של הספרייה להעמיד את אוצרותיה ואת מכמניה לרשות הציבור הרחב בארץ ובעולם, בני דתות שונות, במגוון רחב מאוד, בין פיזית, בין דיגיטלית, לציבורים רחבים. זהו המאמץ המעניין של בניית הבניין החדש, לא חלילה שיש לנו משהו נגד הבניין הזה, אבל הפתיחות והמיקום יאפשרו לנו הנגשה בהיקף הרבה יותר רחב. אבל הדבר השני, הלא פחות מעניין, ואולי החשוב יותר, זה העובדה שאנחנו מנסים לבנות את הספרייה הלאומית, מתוכה פנימה, כמוסד ציבורי רחב, אנחנו מנסים להגביר את התכנים, את האוספים של הספרייה, ליצור ספריית מחקר טובה וראויה יותר, אבל בצד זה להיות מסוגלים אכן לקרוא לציבור הרחב באשר הוא, ליהנות מאוצרותיה, ממעייניה של הספרייה הלאומית. שני הנושאים האלה אינם אירוע של קמים מחר בבוקר ורואים בניין חדש ורואים פעילות חדשה. המדובר בתהליך ארוך ומתמשך שאנחנו מצויים בו כבר כמעט 10 שנים, והוא הולך ותופס תאוצה, הולך ומתרחב. ואני מאמין שכאשר נעבור לבניין החדש, תוך שנים ספורות, כן, אנחנו נעבור בהיקף פעילות הרבה יותר רחב, הרבה יותר מגוון, ואנחנו, אני מקווה, אכן נהיה המוסד התרבותי החשוב והרלוונטי ביותר בארץ. אני מברך את הרב זקס ומודה לו על הנכונות להגיע לירושלים ולשאת את דבריו בספרייה הלאומית של העם היהודי במדינת ישראל. תודה רבה.
גבירותיי ורבותיי, שמחה גדולה וזכות גדולה להיות איתכם במקום המיוחד הזה. בשבילי גן עדן זה ספרייה. אבל אני מאוד מתנצל, ואני מקווה שאתם תסלחו לי אם אמשיך באנגלית, כדי שאני יכול להבין מה שאני מדבר. Let me explain to you, if I may, the difficulties of someone like me. There is translation available. Have you got the headphones? You have them. There are some headphones. Do we have some headphones for people who can't? Okay. Friends, I'm just trying to explain how difficult it is for me, for whom Hebrew is the language of Tanakh, to relate to Hebrew as a language born again in our time. And this occasionally leads to certain misunderstandings. So, for instance, I tell a story of how Elaine and I, true story, were walking along the beach in Tel Aviv. And we see an enormous sign saying, Ein Matzil. And I say to Elaine, I know they're very secular in Tel Aviv, but they need to take out a big sign saying, there is no savior. It took me a day to realize it meant no lifeguard. And one of the great thrills of my life happened a couple of years ago, watching for the first time a football match in Ivrit. I had no idea that, for instance, a foul in Hebrew is averah. So as soon as a footballer gets a red card, the referee comes up and says, "Tzarich la'asot tshuva." I didn't realize that a referee is called a shofet. So when he gives a bad decision, everyone stands up and says, "Hashofet kol haaretz lo yaseh mishpat." but most poetical of all. And this alone justifies coming and living in Israel, is to discover that a draw in Ivrit is teiku, which means when Arsenal and Manchester United score 3 goals each, it's not just a draw as in England, but they invoke the Talmudic principle that we will have to wait until Elijah the prophet comes and tells us whether Arsenal won or Manchester United won. So it's very exciting, but really and truly, I feel bad about speaking in English, but I think I have to. And here it is. As David Bloomberg, and I must say this wonderful library is so blessed by David's leadership, his visionary leadership, and by the superb team led by Aaron Weinberg, the director of the library, and his incredible staff. But what I wanted to do this evening is just share with you the vision of what I think is one of the great projects of the Jewish people, this idea of a new national library, which will be, the plans I think are just being completed, as David said. It's taken wasn't something I said, was it? David said, as David told you, it's taken 10 years, but it's now really beginning to move. And I want to share with you a vision of what a new library for the Jewish world here in Yerushalayim might mean. I want to share with you a vision. And it is something very special. What would make a Jewish library here in Yerushalayim different to any other library in the world? And what is it that is unique, special, to the relationship between Jews and books? And of course, there is something very special to that relationship. Amos Oz and his daughter Fanya recently published their secular credo, their ani ma'amin, of what it is to be a Jew. And they called it Jews and Words. George Steiner has often argued that Jews inhabit language even more than land. The great historian Simon Dubnov, who was shot and was dying in the ghetto in Riga in 1941, his famous last words were Yidden, schreibt und verschreibt, write and record. The last thing he wanted to say to Am Yisrael before he died in the Holocaust is keep writing, as if writing were our most sacred act, as if the witness of words was our legacy to the world. The Gemara in Shabbat, Daf Yud Amud Beis says, Amud Aleph says the following, that Rava was waiting for Rav Hamnuna to turn up in the Shir, and he was late because he was spending extra time davening mincha. And Rava says to Rav Hamnuna, Menichin chaya olam, v'oskim b'chai shah. Look at this. He is forsaking the delights of eternity and immersing himself in the pleasures of this world. Is there any other religion in the universe that would consider prayer a kind of secular pursuit, the pleasures of this world, compared to the eternity that you get in study? I don't know any other religion that made study so much higher than even prayer itself. Indeed, the festivals are called in the Torah Mikra'ei Kodesh. And the word Mikra, as you know, is another name for Torah itself, because from the very outset, in shuls and in the temple itself, these were places not just of prayer, but of reading and interpretation of the sacred texts. So books and the acts of reading and writing and studying and teaching and interpreting and expounding, all these things are absolutely fundamental to Judaism. So, for instance, a few years ago, we had in England a Secretary of State for Education, They always ask me in England, because I always used to do a television program before Rosh Hashanah, and they used to say, doesn't it feel strange beginning a new year at a different time from anyone else? And I said, on the contrary, we celebrate the new year at the same time as everyone else. It's just that when you celebrate the new year, depends on what's really important in your life. For the English, the most important thing is the weather. There's absolutely no doubt in my mind that God created English weather to encourage Aliyah. So you wait till the end of the bleak midwinter, and as soon as that's over, you say a new year. Financially, the new year begins in April. But what is the most important thing for us? It's schools, it's learning. So the Jewish New Year always begins at the same time as the academic year. So he said to me, Chief Rabbi, do you have something to help us, a saying, a sentence, to help us encourage a year of literacy? And I said, what do Jews do at this time of the year? We say, Katvenu b'sefer ha'chaim. Write us in the book of life. When Jews think of life, they think of a book. That is what we're about. And therefore, when the Quran calls us the people of the book, that is one of the understatements of all time. Because as I hope to show you this evening, we are a people only because of the book. So what I want to do tonight is to set a picture, a portrait, a setting in context of a new national library. And I want to do so by showing that the Jewish people exists at the intersection of three extraordinary propositions which shape Jewish life from the beginning, which are special to Judaism, may be unique to humanity. And we will see how the library fits at the intersection of these three narratives. Now, number one, what excites everyone nowadays? IT, right? Information technology. Am I right? Google have just announced that they've invented a driverless car. I think that is probably the most important invention to counter Israeli driving that I've yet come across. It's brilliant. It could have been invented specially for here. Now, I'm very, very excited by information technology, although obviously, why do we have grandchildren? So somebody knows how the things work, And I am given an inferiority complex by my mobile phone, which seems to know almost everything better than I do. Do you have one of these new iPads or iPhones with this digital assistant called Siri? Have you come across this? It's a wonderful thing. I have these wonderful philosophical conversations with my iPad. And I have to tell you, it's an amazing piece of art. I said, Siri, tell me, does God exist? And this computer replies, well, I don't know, he says, it's all a mystery to me. I said, Siri, who do you love? And he replies, this is supposed to be about you, not about me. I think I'm going to make this person inside my iPad a British civil servant because I've never seen it done so well. Well, that is the fourth revolution, the revolution in information technology that we are living through computing, internet, and artificial intelligence. What was the third invention? There have been four in history, four really big ones. The third great moment of innovation in information technology was the invention of printing by Johannes Gutenberg in mid-15th century in Germany and England by Caxton. What was the first real breakthrough in information technology? The first real invention was writing. Writing was, in effect, the birth of civilization. This simple technology allowed for the first time human knowledge to become cumulative, to expand beyond the capacity of a single human memory. What was the first ever writing system? It was cuneiform in Mesopotamia, And writing has been invented independently at different parts of the world 7 times. Mesopotamian cuneiform, Egyptian hieroglyphics, the Chinese ideograms, the Indus Valley script, the Minoan script known as Linear B, and later the Mayans and the Aztecs. Writing was independently invented 7 times. But there is a problem with writing, which is that whether writing takes the form of pictograms or ideograms or syllabaries, those early writing systems all involved a very large number of symbols. From the Chinese, which had 40,000 different symbols, that takes 20 years to learn 40,000 different symbols, to even the most stripped down basic demotic hieroglyphics, which got it down to 450 symbols, but that is still an enormous amount. So when there is writing in this form of these pictograms or ideograms, the result is a hierarchical society, because only an elite will ever know how to read and write. I think the rest, they are the knowledge class, and the masses are illiterate and therefore powerless. So it was actually the second invention in information technology that made the difference, and that called into existence, that coincided with the birth of the Jewish people. What was that revolution in IT? The answer is the invention of the alphabet. That was the decisive thing. And of course, the first form of the alphabet, why is it called alphabet? Because of Aleph, Bet. That's why it's called the alphabet. The first form of this alphabet is known as Proto-Semitic or Proto-Sinaitic. It was first discovered by a British archaeologist called Flinders Petrie in the turquoise mines at Serabit in the Sinai Desert in 1903. Writing, the alphabet seems to have been invented around 38 centuries ago, around the time of Avram Avinu. And as far as we know, the alphabet was invented only once. Every other alphabet in the world is directly or indirectly derived from that first alphabet. Of course, the first alphabet, which had letters for vowels, was Greek already at least 1,000 years later. Greek was the first alphabet with letters for vowels. It was also the first alphabet written from left to right. But the Greek alphabet is directly descended from the Proto-Semitic one. Aleph, Beis, Gimel, Dalet become Alpha, Beta, Gamma, Delta, and it is Greece that is very often seen as the first alphabet. But actually, the Proto-Semitic alphabet was at least 1,000 years earlier. The result is, if you can articulate all the knowledge in the world with a symbol set of only 22 characters, for the first time in history, you have the possibility of a society of universal literacy. And that is the thing that makes Judaism a revolution in human history, because it is literacy that is at the heart of human dignity, as Judaism understands it. And when you have a society of universal literacy, you have the possibility of a society, every one of whose members can be seen as the image and likeness of God. So this is what Isaiah means when he says, V'chol banaich limudei Hashem, v'rav shalom banaich. All your children will be learned of the Lord, not just some of them. And the clearest place that we see this is in the 8th chapter of Sefer Shoftim, where Gideon, who has a problem with the inhabitants of Sukkot who refused to feed his army until they'd beaten the Midianites, chapter 8 of Sefer Shoftim tells us that Gideon came back to the town of Sukkot, caught hold of a child at random in the street, and said to the child, "Write me down the names of the leaders of the town." And the child then writes down the names of the 77 leaders of the town. Now, just work that out. More than 3,000 years ago, Gideon can assume that a child at random in the street knows how to write. When did we have universal literacy in England? 1870. So, this is something absolutely extraordinary. Indeed, Jews became the first, indeed the only civilization that predicated their survival on education. Already in the 1st century, under Rabbi Yoshua ben Gamla, Jews had in Israel a system of universal compulsory education. Again, something that didn't exist in England until the Education Act of 1870. Jews became the people whose heroes are teachers, whose citadels are schools, and whose passion is learning and the life of the mind. And that survives today even among the most secular Jews. Sergey Brin of Google, he of the driverless car, actually said to a reporter once, "I come from one of those secular Russian Jewish families where they expect even the plumber to have a PhD." Now, that is the first point I make, that our people became a people because of the book, because they were there when the book was invented, the birth of the alphabet, which made it possible for everyone to read a book. So Judaism comes into being, or B'nai Yisrael, Am Yisrael, come into being simultaneously with the book. First point. The second point, and this is very, very hard for us to understand at this distance of time, but the birth of monotheism actually created a crisis in the relationship between human beings and the divine. Monotheism was not simply a kind of mathematical reduction of many gods to one. That kind of reduction had already preceded, as it were, Moshe Rabbeinu, because there was, as you know, a famous, controversial pharaoh of Egypt called Amenhotep IV, otherwise known as Akhenaten, who was seen by Sigmund Freud and many others as the first monotheist. Akhenaten worshipped the god of the sun. But that is not what Jewish Judaism is about. It's not what Abrahamic monotheism is about. The real revolution of monotheism is not the reduction of many gods to one, but the idea that God transcends the universe, because God created the universe, and therefore is not to be identified with or even symbolized by anything within the universe itself. And the result is a huge ontological abyss opened up between God and humanity. It's not simply that God is big and we are small, God is powerful and we are powerless. Everyone knew that. The polytheists knew that. It is that in our kind of monotheism, God is a different kind of being altogether, invisible, unknowable, unpredictable, a God that we cannot manipulate by magic or explain by myth or appease by sacrifices. The gods of the ancient world were close. You sensed them all around you in the sun, the moon, the rain, the storm, the ocean, the forces of chaos. The world for the mythological mind, the world was full of gods. And what Judaism does, what the first chapter of Bereshit does, is obliterate that whole world at a stroke. It was the German sociologist Max Weber who said that Bereshit chapter 1 is the decisive birth of Western civilization, where there is no struggle between the gods or between the elements, when God simply calls the world into being. Max Weber called this the disenchantment of the universe, what we would call the demythologization of the universe. And Weber said, if you want to see the roots of Western civilization, of science, and of rationality, that is where you have to turn, to Bereshit chapter 1. But the question is, if God is so beyond the universe, how can we, frail and fallible and finite, relate to God who is infinite? How can we who live within nature relate to God who is beyond nature? And that is the crisis in which Judaism is born. And the answer the Torah gives is very simple. The answer is language. God speaks. And when we speak to God, God listens. That is the fundamental issue. Suddenly, language takes on an immense and fateful consequence with Judaism that it never had before. Indeed, God creates the universe by words. Vayom Elokim, Yehi Or, Vayehi Or. God said, let there be light, and there was light. God creates the world with words. And by creating humanity in his image, the great gift he gave us was the power of words, which Jews have used incessantly ever since. I remember once the BBC did, years ago, a series on the world's great religions. And the presenter finally came to his program on Judaism, and he walks into a yeshiva, and it's, not exactly the British Library, you know what I mean? And he was interviewing Elie Wiesel, and he was saying, Professor Wiesel, Judaism seems like a very noisy religion. He says, do you have such a thing as silence in Judaism? And Wiesel thought for a moment, and he said, Judaism is full of silences. It's just that we don't talk about them. So, as the Targum says in its translation of Bereshit chapter 2, that God formed man from the dust of the earth and breathed into the breath of life, and man became a living being, the Targum says, Ruach Mamala, man became a speaking being. It was that power of words which God gives Adam HaRishon when he gives him permission to name the animals. God's greatest gift is the gift of language. And that then becomes the Gesher Tzar Ma'od, the very narrow bridge that crosses the abyss between finite humanity and the infinity of God. All of a sudden, everything rests on language, on God being able to speak to us and our being able to hear that speech. And what that meant was that Judaism became much less a religion of holy places and of holy people, though we have holy places, Yerushalayim, Ir HaKodesh, and we have holy people, the Kohanim, but above all, Judaism is a religion of holy words. That is where you will find God. Open a Sefer Torah, read. That is what made Judaism completely new in civilization. Now, this is a very subtle idea, and I haven't got time to go into it here. But there was very much a difference. There were two civilizations that thought in these terms. The two civilizations that became the first ever in history to break with myth. One was ancient Israel, the other one was ancient Greece. And there is a subtle difference. They both take language very seriously. There's a subtle difference between the Jewish view of language, Vayom Elokim Yehi, and God said, let there be, and the Greek understanding of language. We know this because the theory of language developed by Plato was then taken up by a Jewish thinker who was very much influenced by Hellenistic ideas, who lived in Alexandria and whose name was Philo, who developed the concept of the logos, the word, which had a huge influence on Christianity. The Gospel of John, which begins, "In the beginning was the Word," comes into Christianity through Philo, and thus Christianity develops a Platonic idea of language, which is different from the Jewish idea of language. Now, suffice it to say that at the heart of Judaism is this remarkable idea contained in the description of the great event that we're going to commemorate and celebrate in a few days' time of Shavuot. As I'm sure you know, where Moshe Rabbeinu is at the end of his life recalling those events in his final address to the Jewish people, the children of those that he brought out of Egypt, he reminds them of the great experience at Mount Sinai and uses a remarkable phrase, remarkable only because it is so ambiguous. I have to say, I studied philosophy at university, and I always remember overhearing two logicians talking as they walked through a Cambridge quadrangle, and one said to the other, "Is ambiguous ambiguous?" And the other one replied, "In what sense?" But the ultimate height of ambiguity is contained in those four words with which Moses sums up the experience of Sinai. He says that what they heard was a kol gadol velo yasaf, a great voice, velo yasaf. And as Rashi points out, it could mean one of two things. Lo yasaf means lo hosif, the voice sounded once and never again. Or, as the Targum translates it, kol gadol velo pasak, a great voice that sounded and never stopped. So it is completely ambiguous. Did the voice happen once and never again, or did it sound once and ever again? And of course, the reconciliation of that contradiction is that there were two modes of communication. The Torah shebichtav, the written Torah, and the Torah sheba'al peh, the oral Torah. The written Torah was given once and never again. But the oral Torah has never ceased. From the days of Moses to today, Jews have engaged in the mandate that God gave us to interpret his word afresh in every generation. So Judaism is, in short, an ongoing conversation between that once and once only divine voice that sounded at Sinai and the human interpretation of those words that has continued in every generation since. It is the great conversation that never ended, incidentally, why I call my things on Parashat HaShavua covenant and conversation, because covenant is mutual. God made it with Israel, Israel made it with God, and the whole of Judaism is that ongoing conversation between Israel and God as to how we understand God's word for all time to make it God's word for this time. And the end result of this was something quite extraordinary. I mean, we all know this, but we don't often stop to remember it. What happened? Having received the Torah from Moses, the Jewish people spent the next 1,000 years writing commentaries to it, which we call Nevi'im and Ketuvim, the other books of Tanakh, from roughly the 13th century BCE to the 3rd century BC, 1,000 years of writing a commentary to the Torah. They then spent the next 1,000 years writing commentaries to the commentary in the form of Midrash, Mishnah, and Gemara. And then they spent another 1,000 years writing commentaries to the commentaries, from biblical interpretation to halakha, to poetry, to philosophy, and to mysticism. For 3,000 years, virtually every word that Jews wrote, almost 99% of what Jews wrote, from 1300 BCE to around the 18th century, for 3,000 years, almost everything that Jews wrote was a commentary to the Torah. It was only in the 19th century that Jews began developing the literature of Haskalah, which was not directly a commentary to the Torah. So Jews became a textual civilization, not only for the reason I made in point 1, that we were there at the invention of the alphabet, but also because in Abrahamic monotheism, God, who is beyond nature, is to be found in a text, the text of Torah. And that text becomes the defining feature of Judaism, which you could understand in two different ways. The mystics and the prophets before them saw that text as a kind of ketubah, a marriage contract between God, the loving God, and his beloved people, or to understand it, as I prefer to do, as the written constitution of Israel as a nation under the sovereignty of God. So for these two reasons, Jews became a people of the text, because of the invention of the alphabet and because only through words could we fully enter into relationship with God. Now, this brings me to the third and final point, in some ways the most poignant of all, and it emerged out of two major crises. The first was the Babylonian exile in the 6th century BCE, and the second, much more seriously, was the tragic events of the 1st and 2nd centuries of the Common Era, the Roman conquest, destruction of the Second Temple, the failure of the Bar Kokhba rebellion, and the dispersion of Jews across the world. And the question was, were Jews no longer a sovereign nation in their own land, scattered instead around the world? Were they still a nation? Now, in any conventional sense, the answer has to be no. What is a nation? It is a group of people who live in the same land, speak the same language, exist under the same government, share the same culture, and participate in the same fate. In any of those senses, Jews were not a nation. They didn't live in the same land that was scattered throughout the world. They did not speak the same language of everyday speech. Rashi was speaking French. Maimonides was speaking Arabic. They were not under the same government or culture. The Balei Tosfot were living under a Christian regime, and the Rif and the Rambam and others under a Muslim one. And they did not share the same fate. While the Jewish communities of Northern Europe were being massacred in 1096 during the First Crusade, Jews in Spain were enjoying their golden age. When the Jews of Spain were exiled, 1492, Jews of Portugal, 1497, and forced to wander the world for a century, the Jews of Poland were enjoying their golden age. So Jews had none of the things that make a nation, and yet they saw themselves and were seen by others as just that, one nation. How was that possible? And the answer lies in the one very unusual fact about Shavuot and Matan Torah, the giving of the Torah. And you can see what is unusual about it if I ask you a very simple question. What comes first in the history of any nation? The land or the law? The country or the constitution? The place or the political structure? The answer is obvious. First, there's the place. Then come the people. They eventually develop into a nation. They develop political structures. They create a ruler or a government who enacts laws. First the land, then the laws. No exception, except one. And that is Judaism. It's the only exception in all of history. As Chazal say, Nitna Torah bamidbar. The Torah was given in the wilderness. First came the law, and only later, as it turned out, an entire generation later, came the land. There's no other example of this in all of history. The result of this was incredibly fateful, because what it meant was, even in exile, even in dispersion, they may have lost the land, but they still had the law. They may have lost their country, but they still had that covenant. That alone sustained them as a nation in the Tfutzot, in the Gola, in Chutz La'aretz. It is the only thing. And God said so explicitly, believe it or not. We read it in Shul a couple of weeks ago. In the midst of the curses, the Tochacha, in Parshat Bechukotai, God says through Moses these words, Va'af gam zot, biotam, be'eretz oivehem, lo mastim v'lo galtim, l'chalotam lahafer briti itam. God says, even in the land of their enemies, I will not break my covenant with them. Because the covenant preceded the country, it survived the loss of the country. The result was, even in Chutz La'aretz, the covenant was still in force. And it is Sadia Gaon in the 10th century who, wrestling with this idea, it puzzled him. How come we, who are scattered all over the world, are still a nation? Sadia Gaon famously said, Ein umatenu uma ela b'torata. Our nation is only a nation in virtue of its Torah. Because of the Torah, and only because of the Torah, Jews throughout the world kept the same religious laws, read the same religious texts, celebrated the same holy days, said pretty much the same prayers. They even faced the same point here, Yerushalayim, when they prayed. Because of that, Jews became the circumference of a circle whose center was here in Yerushalayim. Jews therefore became the first virtual community. The Torah became the first internet, and the Jewish people became the world's first global people. For 2,000 years, the world's only global people. Elaine and I, we used to go to Hong Kong every year because it was part, those days, of the British Commonwealth. And the first time we went, somebody gave us a challah cover. It was only a challah cover, but we loved it because it was designed by a Russian Jew living in Jerusalem, manufactured by China, distributed by Hong Kong. To everyone else, it was just a challah cover. For us, it was the global Jewish people. And that was it. We always were a global people. So what is for everyone else in the 21st century, the newest of the new is for us the oldest of the old. And that was brilliantly summed up by Heinrich Heine in his wonderful phrase that the Torah became the portable homeland of the Jew. Wherever Jews carried Torah, they were at home. Or as we say, and I find this line almost unbearably poignant, we say in one of the piyutim, at the climax of Yom Kippur, in Ne'ilah, and this is the cry of Jews before Medinat Yisrael was recreated. Ein lanu shiur, rak haTorah hazot. This is all we've got left. Rabbanu Shalom, we've lost everything. All we have is this Torah. And it was that text that they could carry wherever they went that allowed Jews to be at home even when they lost their home, because they knew that Torah would carry them back one day here to B'nai Yisrael and here to Yerushalayim Ir HaKodesh. So it was those three things, each one of them unique, that shaped the whole essence of Jewish identity. Not only by virtue of being there for the first alphabet did Jews become the first people of the book. Not only did Jews, by virtue of monotheism, find and were forced to find God in words, but also they were connected globally to one another by this book that they all read, they all engraved on their souls, they all kept, And that text kept Jews together and united as a single nation. So the Torah can be seen as, in every sense, shaping this unique phenomenon of people that only existed because of the book. And indeed, we can see the Torah. We can see the Jewish people in this way, just as you see when you open a Mikras Gedolos, a central text surrounded by commentary. So the Jewish people has its central text here in Yerushalayim HaKodesh, and all the world's communities are like commentaries on that central text, because wherever Jews were, in every community and at every age, they added their own commentaries, so that even though they lived in different cultures and countries and languages and land, they remain part of that single extended conversation between the Jewish people and the God of heaven in dialogue with the terms of our destiny and our covenant. So each of those three is a remarkable phenomenon considered in and of itself. But put them all together and you get something quite extraordinary. And they together open up extraordinary possibilities when they become the backdrop for this project of a new national library in Jerusalem. Let me itemize the implications, which are three. Number one, we began by saying Judaism was born in a revolution in information technology, the birth of the alphabet. Well, if that is so, then this new information technology, much of it shaped by Jews, after all, Sergey Brin of Google, Mark Zuckerberg of Facebook. Gewaldig, isn't it? I don't know if you ever saw the film The Social Network. Here's the story. Jewish guy goes to Harvard, has a row with his girlfriend, goes back to his room, invents Facebook, and changes the world. That's a lovely story. Here is this technology which we helped to shape. We must use this new technology for the new library, creatively, innovatively, to achieve our version in our time, in the 21st century, of what the invention of the alphabet did 38 centuries ago. Because the alphabet, I recall, opened up to everyone, democratized access to information. And that democratic access to knowledge is what Judaism sees as fundamental to human dignity and equality. Incidentally, the Jewish idea is the only one that has a chance of working. Let me explain why. Every other form of equality has been based on either an equality of power or of wealth. Now, the trouble with democracy and equality of power, well, can you ever agree? Can you ever imagine Jews actually agreeing to give everyone equal power? I mean, just forget it, you know. Jewish democracy. I tell you the problem. Democracy, power, and wealth are both what I call material goods. And the trouble with material goods is the more you share, the less you have. I remember the shul president who used to get up at every meeting and say, all those in favor say aye, and all those against say, I resign. That is Jewish democracy. So if you have total power, but you decide to share it with 9 other people, the result is you only have 1/10 as much power as you began with. If you have $1,000 and share it with 9 other people, you're left with only 1/10 as much money as you began with. But if you have a certain amount of knowledge and you share that with 9 others, do you have less? Maybe you have more. Mikol melamdai hiskalti. The more we teach our knowledge to others, the more we learn. So, whereas wealth and power, at least in the short term, are zero-sum games, which means the more I share, the less I have, it means that wealth and power, the economy and the state, economics and politics, are always arenas of conflict. But knowledge is not, because the more I give away, the more I have. That is why the Jewish version of an egalitarian society, a society in which everyone reaches his or her own full dignity by having access to education and to knowledge, is the only form of egalitarianism that really has worked and will continue to work. So if somehow this National Library can open up its wealth of knowledge by using digitization and the internet and making all its stuff available to everyone through a modem or through a Bluetooth connection, that would be revolution number one. Number two, it is a library that can connect Jews in this very, very fragmented Jewish world that we have now. Fragmented religiously, fragmented between religious and secular. But as I began by saying, if there's one thing that even secular Jews believe profoundly, it is that we have a share in this heritage of literature and literacy that makes the Jewish people what it is. That's what Amos Oz was trying to tell us. That is what that wonderful lady, Ruth Calderon, was doing in her maiden speech in the Knesset, when as a lady and as a secular Jew, she gets up and gives a Gemara shir to the members of Knesset. It was a brilliant shir, and it was a lovely way of saying, you know what? This text belongs to all of us. Torah tziva lana Moshe, Morasha Kilat Yaakov. It belongs to all of us. So a campaign, a way of extending the library so that everyone can plug into it is a way of opening up the Jewish text and the Jewish commentary to what Torah Shebal Peh is really supposed to be, the ongoing conversation scored for many voices of Jews in conversation with the terms of their destiny. And we like argument. In fact, I don't think we know any other form of conversation. In fact, when I did a public conversation with Amos Oz, his opening sentence was, I don't think I'm going to agree with Rabbi Sachs about everything, but then on most things, I don't agree with myself. So that is how we use a national library to say, you are all a letter in this scroll. You are all a part of the Jewish conversation. And finally, my point about the Torah sustaining Jews as a global people means that I believe that this new library to be built here in Yerushalayim Eir HaKodesh cannot be simply and merely a national library. It must be a global library, because it was only books that kept us together as a global people. And how wonderful if through the internet and through digitization of all the manuscripts and books and journals in this library, we could indeed allow any Jew anywhere in the world to access this heritage. Would it not be wonderful if, coincidentally with the building of this new Jewish library, went a worldwide campaign of Jewish literacy, which really could engage the imagination of Jews throughout the world, regardless of whether they're religious or secular. It is therefore my hope and my dream that the day will come when visitors to the state of Israel, be they presidents, prime ministers, or popes, will be taken not first to Yad Vashem, however important that is, but first to the new national and international library, which I propose should be subtitled The Home of the Book for the People of the Book. And let us show the world not only how Jews died, but how Jews live. And I have to tell you, here something deeply personal. You know, I love atheists, I really do. I call them His Majesty's loyal opposition. But among atheists, my personal favorite, the greatest atheist of all time, because he was the most honest atheist of all time, was Nietzsche. Nietzsche was a very profound thinker. Many people think that Nietzsche was anti-Semitic. Nietzsche wasn't anti-Semitic. He did not dislike Jews, but he deeply disliked Judaism. In fact, many people hated Jews because they didn't become Christian. Nietzsche hated Jews because they gave birth to Christianity. He regarded Judaism and Christianity as what he called the slave revolt in morals. Judaism and Christianity is what happened when slaves defeated their masters and imposed their code on everyone. And Nietzsche rightly saw that Jews were his most formidable opponents. Nietzsche defined his own philosophy as the will to power. I define Judaism as the will to life, and they are opposed principles. But the way I want to define it very simply for this evening is that Nietzsche framed the eternal human choice between, on the one hand, the idea of power, and on the other hand, the power of ideas. Judaism showed the world the power of ideas, simple ideas that can transform the world not through war, but through education. And that is what I would like a new national and international Jewish library to be. Now, if those who built this land and this state, the Giborei Haaretz v'Hamedina, if they were motivated by one idea, which they were, by the prophetic vision of Shivat Zion, articulated by all the prophets, by Jeremiah's insistence, Yesh tikva la'achar yitech v'shavu banim ligvulam, the day will come when Jews will return to their land. If that idea motivated people to create this state, so may those who design and build this new library, led by David Bloomberg and his wonderful team, be lifted and inspired by a no less famous vision and a no less magnificent one. The words of Isaiah that we all know, Valchu amim rabim. There will come a time when many nations say, Va'amru lechu v'na'aleh el har Hashem. Let us come and visit the mountain of the Lord, Jerusalem. Ki mitzion tetzeh Torah udva Hashem Yerushalayim. The time will come when the nations of the world will recognize that the power of ideas is greater than the idea of power. And on that day, from Zion will go forth the Torah and the word of God from Jerusalem. Let us show the world that other face of Israel, the people of the book in the land of the book, whose language is the language of the book, even when they're talking about football, and whose landscape is the landscape of the book. That book that inspired some of the greatest moral visions and greatest religious poetry the world has ever known. To build this home of the book dedicated to the people of that book is a project that could bring blessing, not just to Israel, and not just to the Jewish people worldwide, but to the entire world. May that great project materialize here in our time. Bimheira, b'yameinu. Amen.